Good morning, readers. Well, today is release day for Fail, which is book number 6 in the Medical Kidnap Files. This is a young adult suspense medical series, and it's book number 6. You can read it as a standalone, or you can read it together with the rest of the series. First one in the series is Mito, and if you click through on my blog, then there's a link to Mito as well as to Fail. If you pre-ordered Fail, then it should be in your inbox or on your device now. If you haven't, then there's a link below, and you can head on over to buy it. As usual on release day, I will do a short reading from the first chapter of Fail. Kira watched Malachi playing with the toys in the waiting room. She really hated his playing with communal toys, especially in a place like a doctor's office, worried that he would pick up some bug. He was so miserable when he got sick. Who knew how often the doctor's office sanitized the toys, and how many other kids had touched them or put them in their mouths since they had last been cleaned? Of course, at this age, everything went into Malachi's mouth. Kira's mom said it was the way that babies explored the world. You really couldn't stop them. But she tried to engage him in pushing the cars around the little track instead of picking them up and putting them in his mouth. "He's so adorable," said one of the mothers sitting nearby, a polished white woman with a sullen-looking girl sitting in the seat next to her, about 6 years old, pudgy and looking miserable. "How old is he?" 14 months, Kira said. She watched the mother's face as she considered this revelation. That realization that Malachi wasn't a baby, but a toddler. "He's so tiny," the woman said, eyes wide. "He was premature. He hasn't caught up yet." "Oh," the woman drew out the word and nodded her understanding. Kiera wasn't sure how much longer she'd be able to keep using that to explain why Malachi was so much smaller than other babies his age. He was supposed to be caught up by 18 months or 2 years old, something like that. The little girl was eyeing Kiera. "Are you having another baby?" The mother elbowed her. "Francie, that's not something we ask people." "Why not?" Francie protested. "She has a big tummy." "It's not polite to ask." Kira held her big tummy, looking down at it and feeling for a kick. She was bigger than she had been with Malachi, but she was already past the point she'd been at when she'd gone into labor with him. "I am pregnant," she told Francie and her mother. "I'm going to have another baby." "They'll be very close together," the woman said with disapproval. What business was that of hers? Kiara had often wished that she and Carmel were closer together in age, so that Carmel was her playmate instead of just a bratty little sister. 6 years was a big gap when you were little. "Don't put that in your mouth, Malachi." Kiara pulled the toy car away from his mouth and put it on the track, trying to encourage him to push it around. Shouldn't he be pushing it around, using the toy for what it was made for, instead of just putting things in his mouth? But Malachi stubbornly raised it to his mouth again. Kara picked him up and put him on her lap, then bent back down to find a teething biscuit in the diaper bag. She pulled the car away and offered him the biscuit instead. "Do you want a cookie? Have a cookie to chew on instead of the nasty car. It's dirty, Malachi." "No!" He fussed and bucked to get away from her, trying to reach the car again and uninterested in the biscuit. Frustrated, Kira let him slide back down to the floor, screaming his protest at having his toy taken away. Of course, that was when the nurse chose to come out and call for Malachi. "Malachi Oz?" Kira nodded tiredly. She shoved the teething biscuit back into the diaper bag. "We'll be right behind you." She'd hoped that the nurse would go ahead, leading the way to the first examining room. Kiara already knew where it was and didn't want the nurse hovering over her as she struggled to pick up the kicking, screaming baby, sling the diaper bag over her shoulder, and stay balanced with her pregnant belly stuck out far in front of her. "Malachi, shush! You would have had to leave the toys there anyway. It's time to see the doctor." But of course, reasoning with him had no effect, except to make him yell louder in protest. Kiara carried him to the large examining room. "What's the matter, little britches?" the nurse asked as she took Malachi from Kiara. She put him down on the examining table and began to remove his clothing. Kiara was expecting him to scream louder at this treatment, but he was surprised. He surprised her by chugging to a stop and watching the nurse wide-eyed as she stripped him down to his diaper. The nurse cooed at him and dangled a toy in front of him to grasp. Before long, Malachi seemed perfectly content, forgetting the car being stolen away from him. "So, how's he been doing, Mum?" the nurse asked Kira without looking at her. "Any concerns?" Kira sighed. She stared down at Malachi, his dark skin a stark contrast to the snowy white of the disposable diaper. He looked like a much younger baby. She tried to quantify it. Not as big as the other babies his age. As small as a 1-year-old? A 9-month-old? 6-month-old? His eyes sparkled, and he babbled as he swatted the toy the nurse was teasing him with. He was bright, so it wasn't that he wasn't developing. He could say a few words, his favorite being no, of course, and while he wasn't walking, he was crawling plenty, or hitching himself around while sitting on his bottom. He liked watching the toddler shows on TV. Not that she let him watch screens all the time. She knew that medical professionals didn't think that was a good idea for babies' developing brains. But sometimes she needed a digital babysitter so that she could make supper for Malachi, or catch up on something else important. He was quite active, a going concern, as her mother said. "Just with him being so small," she told the nurse. "I know the doctor said he should have put on more weight by now, and he hasn't. I've done everything I can to get more calories in him, but he's stubborn. He just doesn't want to eat sometimes, and there's nothing I can do to make him." The nurse nodded. She measured his length, scribbled it down on her clipboard notes, then transferred him to the basket of the baby scale. Not the scale for older patients that he would need to stand on. The nurse's eyes were quick as she checked the weight reading and noted it down as well. "He was heavier than that when I weighed him at home," Kira said. "Are you sure that's right?" The nurse looked at her. "Of course I am. It's just that weight fluctuates throughout the day and from day to day. It will depend on whether he's had bowel movement, how much clothing he has on, whether he's eaten anything. But this scale is more accurate than your home scale." Kira thought that was a little presumptuous. The nurse didn't know what kind of scale she had at home. It could be a really high-tech, accurate atomic thing. But it wasn't. It was just a Weight Watcher scale. Kira would weigh herself, then pick up Malachi, weigh herself again, and figure out his weight by subtracting. "He hasn't gained anything since the last appointment," the nurse noted. A few ounces. But even if he had gained a few ounces, which was doubtful, that still wasn't what he needed to gain to be on track. "He's on a plateau right now," the nurse said. "Babies don't always gain at a regular rate. Sometimes they'll stay the same for a long time and then go up suddenly. We'll see what the doctor has to say." Kira nodded. The nurse picked Malachi up and handed him to her. Then, while Kira held him, she pulled out the paper on the examining table and tore off the used portion, like he'd contaminated it. But Kira knew it was just the usual protocol. It didn't mean that they thought Malachi was dirty. "Is he up to date on his vaccinations?" the nurse asked, looking back down at her clipboard and continuing with the routine checkup questions. "No, because of him being premature. I want to make sure that he has a healthy immune system before catching up on all the jabs." "Is he going to daycare?" "Yes. All kids going to daycare should be fully vaccinated. You're lucky even to be able to get into a daycare without proof that he's up to date on his shots." Kira didn't correct herself and say that Malachi was in a day home rather than a big daycare, a mom who took on a few other kids. She'd never asked about vaccinations. Maybe if measles was going around, she would, but otherwise it was just a place to take Malachi for a few hours when Kira had to work or go out with Jamal. She was wondering about starting a day home herself once the new baby arrived. It would be a way to stay home with them both and still make a little money. But she still hadn't figured out whether she was going to move in with Jamal once the baby was born. They'd talked around the subject, but he hadn't asked her to move in. She wasn't sure how she'd support herself and the kids if she weren't living with someone else. "Miss Oz?" Kira came back down to earth. She looked at the nurse. "Sorry, what? Any recent illnesses, rash, fever, anything that has concerned you?" "No, he's been fine. A couple of colds, but nothing serious. He's always on the move." Malachi was starting to squirm and complain in her arms, no longer entertained by being somewhere new. Kira kissed him on top of his black, tightly curled hair. "Come on, baby, don't fuss." She looked at the nurse, raising her eyebrows, wondering if they were ready to go to the smaller examining room and talk to the doctor. The nurse nodded. "This way, then. Kiara followed her down the hall to the next room. She was beginning to feel like she shouldn't have bothered to come. She needed advice, not just observations that Malachi wasn't gaining weight. She already knew that. Okay, so that is from Chapter 1 of Fail, Medical Kidnap Files number 6. You can pick it up today. Just head over, click on the link to the links on my website, and you'll be able to find it. And in my blog posts, and I've listed a number of other new releases that you might be interested in. So check those out as well. Talk to you next week. Thanks.